But
perhaps Fiona could say a few words while we're waiting for people to join about what the Island Jura Peatlands project is all about, what it's trying to achieve.
Okay. The Island Jura Peatland project is an engagement project, basically, that the CAN network are doing a lot of work on the Rins of Islay on a number of sites, clearing rhododendron and helping deer management on crucial kind of SAC sites on Islay. And so as an organisation, Islay Natural History Trust has been contracted to undertake surveys the past 3 years on birds and marsh fritillaries. And part of the culmination of their project is that we do engagement on Islay and highlighting the importance of peatland as a habitat and all the elements that go with it. So we've embraced that because it fits in with our ethos of promoting and educating folk to the wildlife and natural history on the island. It suits all the elements that we do. So we're running training for species identification. So we have a sphagnum training course on tomorrow for kind of professional folk dealing in the peatland areas, and we'll open it out to the general public for another session a bit later in the summer. And we've got a number of walks on. So we've got 2 walks this month, taking folk out onto peatland and peat bog next Thursday and the following Sunday. So a shorter walk onto Dulocks and showing people the importance of peatland, and a more arduous walk up Castle Hill on the following Sunday. And it's really just to engage with folk, whatever peatland means to them. And the culmination of the whole summer is that we're running a competition for poetry and photography for people to kind of capture what peatland means to them in whatever form, you know, whether they see it and want to capture it in image, or they want to talk about it. So we've already had a talk from Laurie Campbell last month, the month before, promoting sort of his experiences of photography, photographing peatland areas. And very kindly, Donald's agreed to give us a talk tonight to try and highlight the literary elements to peatland. That hopefully the end of July, people have submitted all their entries. We'll have a nice prizes for people to, and we'll have a mobile exhibition to exhibit what people have entered throughout the island and move to different villages to try and engage folk wherever they are. So
it's been great, actually. I found it very. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been surprised, but the Peatland project has been very illuminating for me, because having been brought up in Lewis myself, I never really thought of Islay as a place of peatlands. I knew there were peat banks and so on here, and they cut the peats for, my mother's family used to cut the peats for Lafroig. And I was aware that there was some peat production in Islay, but I hadn't really realised how much of the island was actually basically moorland, was basically peat. You think, because we all think of Islay as being the most fertile arable sort of place in the whole of the Hebrides, but I think it's something. Is it right that it's about 60% of the island?
Yeah, I worked out looking on the map that it's roughly about 60% of the landmass is under peatland. Whether it be kind of bog or upland, it's still significantly high, despite all the farmland and other areas in the low ground. So it's nice that we have a full range of habitats within our one island. So.
Okay, so maybe are we ready to start with Donald?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just before we start, I just want to say this is being streamed onto Facebook as well, so there are probably more people than just the 15 of us that are here at the moment on Zoom. So we are recording it, and it's being broadcast live through the Islay Book Festival Facebook page. That's a first for me. I never tried that before. So hopefully it'll work. Okay, Angus, you're introducing Donald, yeah?
Well, I thought Fiona was, but I can do briefly. I mean, Donald is knows Islay well. He was here in 2018 presenting his book about peatlands called The Dark Stuff, which is a fantastic read for anybody who's not seen it yet. And over the last week or so, I've been sharing some of his poetry, a lot of which is influenced by the landscapes of moorland and the wildlife and so on. And I believe he told me he'd been working on a new collection of poetry. I think we're going to hear some of that tonight during lockdown. And what else can I say? I mean, I absolutely loved Donald's first book, As a Woman Lay Dreaming, which won the Paul Torday Memorial Prize, I think it was. And I've not read In a Veil of Mist, which is his second novel, which came out at the end of last year, but I'm really looking forward to that. And that, I think in the Hebrides today, there isn't a better sort of person doing that kind of nature writing and reportage about the cultural heritage and that kind of great block of history that informs, that really infuses our lives here for people who live in the Hebrides. So when Fiona asked me, who could we get to talk about writing about peatlands and peat, there was kind of unanimity about where to go. So hence Donald is with us this evening. So over to you, Donald.
Okay, hi. My other connection with Islay is my son actually worked there for a while. He worked in the Gaelic place. He was working there for a time too. So I went to see him while he was there. That's a number of years ago. He's since moved on. He's now gradually moving more north. He's now in Skye. At the moment, he works in staffing for the community trust there. So that's my knowledge of Islay, apart from clearly my taste buds. I've acquired knowledge on a number of occasions over the years. I've always been fascinated by peatland. I think lots and lots of reasons for that. In that, we used to spend. I used to curse the fact we spent most of our summer holidays out there. We would go out there, from about I was about 13, 14. I was brought up, but quite unusually, I was brought up by my dad, and we had an uncle in the house too. So I was brought up in a male-only household. I wasn't actually brought up. There was no. My mother wasn't on the scene. So I was brought up by my dad and my uncle. So my brother and I used to regularly help out, going out to the moorland and cut peats, from fairly early on. I think about 12, 13, I used to go out there, move the turf from them, and then, help my dad and my uncle to dig them. I had the easy task. I was never given the hard task. I was the man who used to cut his dad's fingers while we were, he bent down below and he lifted them and heaved them into position. I was the one who was slightly sadistic, well, actually clumsy one, sadistic. We used to cut him quite regularly as I worked along that way. And then, of course, when we had cut them, we used to put them into wee stacks. And to, initially, then we used to, lift them again, change direction. It was quite a fun way to have a summer holiday sometimes. And then you put in a wheelbarrow, cross a wooden bridge, and then finally we would have the peats coming home, later on in the year. And that was a marvelous occasion in some ways. I'm being slightly sarcastic about the enjoyable aspects of the rest, but when, you know, because a lot of the men and the women of the village used to help out, and they used to go and fill the trailer, and others used to go and you know, build the stack at the house, and that was a very festive occasion. That was you know, there were gatherings all over the place, and of course you went out to help them too. So I was doing that from a fairly early age, and being rewarded with scones and cake and duff, which was the Lewis speciality, you know, for taking part in these enterprises. The other way I got to know the moor was from a very early age. I had an uncle, Alec, who was my aunt's, well, great uncle, who was my grandmother's sister's husband. And he used to take me out to the moor too, from about the age of 6 or 7, when they went to gather sheep. Now, I don't think that was unusual at the time. You know, the sheep, the Ness Moor is quite an expansive moor. I think the Barras Moor is, or the Ness Moor is among the top 3 in terms of size. I think that actually is number 2, if I remember rightly. Number 1 is the Caithness, you know, the flow country there in terms of size. Barras Moor is, I think, number 2. And also, I think, the island of Yell, not far from here in Shetland, in mainland Shetland, is number 3 in terms of sheer scale of peatland. And it's one of the reasons why they did contemplate in the 60s and 70s having peat power stations in all these areas at one time. So that, I think, is the source of the inspiration. I also had a great uncle, Alan, who would have been, again, my grandmother's brother in this case, who was crippled down one side of his body. Now, according to the story, that was that he had become crippled when he went out to Liverpool to join the First World War, and he had somehow acquired rheumatic fever. But he was known throughout the island as somebody who could identify virtually every sheep. He knew not just the colours of these sheep, but the ear marks that they used to have on the sheep. There were different ear marks, and you know, there was a cut. Sometimes a cut at the top of the sheep, cut at the bottom. I think that was ours. That's why I remember that one. So he knew, you know, so he used to go around the moor from a very early age. You know, had clearly a very unfortunate life, you know, from his teens, you know, having this, you know, being paralyzed down one side. But he used to wander the moor, and well, you know, one wonders why he spent so long wandering the moor. You know, I think sometimes it would have been to give his sister the chance, and a sister and her husband the chance to just to bring up their own children in peace and without any great you know, bother. So that might have been a reason for that. But he was renowned in the district for his knowledge of the moorland. He was the one he was the go-to person. I remember, you know, as a primary school child, my primary school teacher, you know, talking about my great uncle and how he was by far the best shepherd in the district. And I remember feeling, you know, puffed up with pride about that. So I think that was the beginning of my love affair with the moorland. I have to say, I also had, when I was in I think my second last year in school, I had this romantic relationship with this girl from Stornoway, and she gave me a present for my birthday, I think probably my 16th birthday. And it was Corgi Modern Poets, collections of Corgi Modern Poets. And I remember there was Ian Crichton-Smith was in it, Philip Larkin was in it, and Tom Gunn and Seamus Heaney was in that collection. And first of all, I didn't want to read the books. You know, when you're about 16, and but the last thing you want to do is, read verse. I mean, you could, I read, lots of novels and non-fiction, but the idea of reading poetry, but I thought if I wanted to maintain my relationship with her, I better sit down and read this book. And I remember loving it. I remember loving the Seamus Heaney poems at that time, and it was his early poetry. He wasn't at that time. He wasn't a terribly well-known poet. It was. I remember Death of a Naturalist being in that book, and I remember Digging, for instance. So it was very much his early poetry, and that, I think, cemented my relationship. If that's the wrong word to use, but cemented my relationship with the moorland. In that I could see that that you could draw from that. You could draw from island life. And I remember thinking, the other person I remember very much, well, it was Ian Crichton-Smith too, who had obviously gone to the same secondary school as me, but also the other one I remember reading at that time was George Mackay-Brown. Similar effects on me. The fact that these people were all islanders and writing books, were fantastic. And also, I think, became aware that they were all subject to the same kind of linguistic tensions that I had, all of them. Ian Crichton-Smith came clearly from a Gaelic-speaking background, growing up in Lewis. Seamus Heaney, I remember reading that his mother was very much Ulster industrial classes, whereas his father was very much the Gaelic agricultural, part of it. Donegal, was a tension there. The last one, of course, was George Mackay-Brown, and Arcadians will never tell you this, so this is a secret, okay?
Right.
This is, keep this nice and quiet. George Mackay-Brown had, of course, a Gaelic-speaking mother from Sutherland. I think that's what lies behind an awful lot of his writing, in that he's got that exactness that comes from first-generation English speakers that, Crichton-Smith and Heaney, and, we could go Dylan Thomas and Norman MacCaig. We can mention all of these names in that, in that same bag. But Heaney, I think, allowed me to think of the moorland in a very, very different way from, the normal way of seeing it. I think, before that, I suppose if I thought of the moorland at all, it was a place of work, a place of labour. It was also a place where murderers frequented, because the other thing, of course, about Lewis is the moorland was meant to be the abode of a guy called Mackinthorny. Any of you heard of that guy? Yes, I see. Mackinthorny was this murderer, 19th century murderer who came from Garve, just outside Garve on the Scottish mainland. The name, we used to be told that he got the name Stronach because he bit someone's nose, but in fact, the surname was Stronach. And there were a lot of tales of that kind, but moorland, murders, moorland ghosts, lights appearing on the moor. But Heaney, I think, taught me to, when I read his work, and particularly even later on when I read his work about the bog bodies, and his work taught me to see in an entirely different way. So I owe him a great debt of gratitude. I did meet him on one occasion. I was very lucky to meet him in Rasi, and we spent time together in Solmore Rustic and Skye, and that was just a lovely conversation. So I really enjoyed spending a night drinking, I have to say, with Seamus Heaney. Probably the most worthwhile hangover I ever had in my entire life. Probably the only worthwhile hangover I've ever had in my entire life. So that is, I think, how I came to see the moorland differently, from most of my acquaintances. I don't know if that makes any sense. Any questions? I know that was quite rambling and yeah, about that. I think the evidence, funny enough, this is my earliest collection of short stories, and I think I was in my 20s, 30s when I wrote some of them way back. And it's a book called Special Deliverance, and it cost £4.95 at the time. But quite fascinated with Margaret Thatcher's idea of, I think, getting rid of Liverpool was certainly one of, because there was a riot in Liverpool. And I kind of wrote this short story, which appeared in Radical Scotland, which was about the clearance of Liverpool, and sending them all out to Lewis Moore in order to cut peats, to be taught how to cut peats. So that was probably one of my earlier stories about the moorland, but it was a lot, from early days in that. Okay. I'll pause every so often to invite questions. Yes.
Oh, there's a question from Vanessa in the chat for you.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it out?
Hi, yeah, I've just come back from the Isles of Harris and Lewis, actually, just 2 days ago, and I'm missing it so much already. And I've just started writing, and very much on the beginning of the journey. And I would love to know your process for how you go about writing a poem. Do you have like a particular process you go through, or does it just come to you like in moments of inspiration? I'd just love to know, because I'm still really early days on this.
I think I do have a process, but it's almost an accidental one. And for writing a poem, I often find that I go out walking, and that's when I start. I think there's something about the rhythm of walking, even the rhythm. I always think, for instance, I used to teach, I was an English teacher for years, and I used to teach about the iambic pentameters. And afterwards, I suddenly realized the appeal of the iambic pentameter is actually because it imitates the rhythms of the human heart. And I think there is something about that in walking too, the simple act of walking. So this, for instance, it's quite a slight collection of poems I wrote in lockdown. This is the one which Angus mentioned earlier, which is called The Man Who Talks to Birds. I found what I was doing was I was just walking around and observing, what I have here. Now here it's largely moor. I do miss part of Lewis and Harris. When I say I miss most, it's probably walking in the Macha, and the shoreline there, which I think is lovely here. Whereas here there's not much of that, but the moorland itself is interesting. So these are the kind of things. So there was a damp day in June, which I wrote about. Each clump of heather, a clenched fist, punching its weight out from peat. Each knotted stems, a twisted muscle drawing strength from the stored heat of darkness, the layers of centuries, rot and decay, loss and grief, until in August it alters shade, no longer strictly brown or green, a mingling of leaves, but with burnished red and purple flowers, as if some blood shed in the past from the earth has seeped. And you know, for instance, so that, and I think the other thing is you don't worry about repeating yourself. If you do repeat yourself, go with it. You just write. So, for instance, another one I did about a misty day. I don't know if you watch, when you walk along heather and you see how spiders' webs have cloaked stalks of heather. And that's, this one was in May. Today, I noticed on my morning walk how cobwebs can lace together heather stalks on still days like these. Spiders imitating clouds that clamp us down, knitting funeral shrouds for insects scrambling round the edges of moor, mimicking that mist we sometimes feel has trapped us in this village, having strolled these same roads 1,000 times before. So you don't worry about repeating yourself, you just go with it. And I always think if you can get the rhythm of the first line in your head, things will flow from that. Is that helpful, Vanessa? I do think it's walking. I think that kind of physical exercise, I find it. I'm sitting here for a long time trying to think of a verse. I can't write it. I can write prose sitting here. I can't, however, write verse.
That's really helpful, thank you. And yeah, one of the things I've been doing over the last 10 days is a lot of walking, and it's funny how you get that inspiration that comes to you when you're out and about, isn't it? I just need to think about.
And in many ways, you're also kind of, we all have troubles. Every one of us have our occasional doubts and troubles. In a way, by walking, you can almost shed these troubles. There's something about the simplicity of walking that allows you to do that. So it allows you to concentrate on what's seeing around you.
Could I ask, Donald, do you think that lockdown was a particularly conducive period to writing in general? I mean, did you, because there wasn't much else to do apart from walking? And
I thought it was great. Particularly at the beginning, not so much towards the end. I've also been teaching. They've had problems getting staff in the Anderson High and Lerwick and English staff, and I've been going in the last wee while, and I've been doing quite a lot of teaching there, because they're still short of staff at the moment. So during the lockdown period, I wrote this, again, quite slim collection of poetry. I also wrote the bulk of a book about lighthouses, which is coming out in July, I think July the 29th, it's going to be an absolutely gorgeous book. I mean, it's just, I think there's 100 images of lighthouses all around the Scottish coastline, including some from Islay, I think, if my memory serves me well. So there's that, and I wrote that book, and that was about 60,000 words. In that book, talking about what lighthouses meant to me, because in the sense I also grew up near the Buttle Lewis Lighthouse, and that was just in the corner of my eye when I grew up. I also worked for a while in Uist and Benbecula, and I could see the Monaghan Islands Lighthouse. And if I look outside the window, I can see the Bresson Lighthouse here in my view. So again, I felt quite inspired about that. I'll read a wee bit of In a Veil of Mist, which talks about the moorland. Is that all right? Because this is my other book that I wrote during lockdown. And it's about one of the characters is Jessie, who is a single woman whose boyfriend left her to go on the Metagama in the 1920s and disappeared, despite the fact, and she waited for him, you know, many, many decades in the hope that he would invite her to go to Canada or the States with her. But she also is based on a lot of older women I knew. When I grew up in the village, we had an awful lot of single women in the village. Sometimes widows, you know, had lost men in the First World War, or you know, some of the other things. The other thing they had was the woman too were some of the one or two of the women who would go out to the moor and collect things. And so this is about what they used to gather out there. It was mainly Lusnoloi or bogbean that she gathered near the edge of walks. The trick was to pull the plants out by the roots shortly after their white feathery flower had died away, their fruits having formed. After this, they would be cleaned and boiled, simmering away for a couple of hours in a pan before the liquid was squeezed, stained and bottled. A number of people took this in the village, believing it cured all their ills and ailments. Some would even hold their noses as they swallowed the potion, gulping as they swigged it down. It's a lot better than pills from Dr. Gillis or Dr. Macaulay. Much, much better. Goodness knows what might happen if their medicines ever stop working and we've forgotten all about we've used for centuries before. I was thinking actually in some ways about the lockdown, about the coronavirus, and I kind of wrote that sentence. There were other flowers too she lifted as she walked along. The yellow flowers of tormentil that sometimes gleamed alongside a peat track. She had heard this called by two names, Brennan Frey or Brennan Vateruach. She preferred the second name, summoning up visions of the fox for her, patrolling the borders of North Tulsa. Its eye perhaps on the sheep that grazed there, rather than a reminder of the heather that was all around her. It was used when someone was suffering diarrhea, and it was for John's wart. Achlushan Columkila, actually, Achlushan, yes, armpits, elbows, Achlush, yeah, Columkila, St. Columbus, to cheer people up when they felt miserable and low. Occasionally in patches of green, there was self-heal growing, Us Free, which despite its name was good for sore throats and wounds. She loved the way too that both weather and season played with the shades, mixing and mingling, changing the moor's hues from brown to green, sometimes sprinkling other colours within its length and breadth. She plucked these plants, occasionally sipping water from a stream she knew ran fresh and clear, bending down to cup it in her palm. All the time she was conscious of the birds around her, their flights attending each stride of her walk. She could see a group of ravens picking away at something at the edge of a loch, watched by a seagull that followed her every move. For a moment, she wondered if they might have swooped down on another monkey or chubby little rat swept in on the tide. I'll have to explain the background to that later. Tearing its flesh till bone was exposed, but she shook her head, chasing the thought from her head. Instead, she glanced at a curlew a short distance away, probing peat or mud before tugging out its prey with a wriggle of its bill. There was also a heron standing on Loch Wangavat, upright and weary. From time to time, it appeared to gaze in her direction in a maniacal way, its yellow eyes glaring as if it were one of those busybodies from the village, watching everybody else's moves. So that's that would have been certainly the lives of my ancestors would have gone out to the moorland, for these reasons. They would have collected various flowers and for various purposes and medicines. And we've kind of lost touch with that as an idea. So I had the character of Jesse doing that. I noticed Isla's asked me a question there. Does the Gaelic language particularly lend itself to writing about peatlands? Do you think? I think it probably does, because it has this kind of a knowledge to it, but not exclusively so. I should put it. In Gaelic music, there's an awful lot of songs about, for instance, Lewis is always described as INHT, the Heather Island. There's a lot of songs about the moorland, and I contain one or two of them in the book, which is kind of inspired by music. Whereas I can't think of many English equivalents. Apart from, I suppose, the more famous ones like the Bronte sister, works of the Bronte sisters, and things like that. But I can't think of many English equivalents of that. But certainly in terms of song, there's a fair number in Gaelic. The songs about landscape. Yeah. Just seeing if there's any questions waiting. So.
Well, maybe I could sort of another great theme, and apart from the inspiration of the landscape, the particular sort of endlessly variable landscape of moorland in Scotland. Another great theme is a particular tradition of peat cutting, taking home the peats, the collective effort. Maybe you could chat a little bit about that, because I think for anybody who hasn't experienced that, I think it's difficult to understand what an important part of the year and how it framed the year in the Hebrides for really right up until the 1970s, I would say.
I think even, possibly even later, it would have been, I think it started dying away in about the early 80s, actually, in Lewis, that kind of thing, as I say. I think people wanted, it started, I think, at that time, they wanted holidays, they wanted breaks away from the landscape. Things like going to the continent started being mentioned, before that, they certainly went, before that time, your holiday was on the moor. And another thing which I didn't mention when I was talking about peat cutting was, of course, there was the Abbey. There was the shieling, where they went out in the moor. So, for instance, my ancestors would have gone out, particularly the woman in the family and the children in the family would have gone out to the shieling out in the moor. Now, there were a number of benefits for that. It allowed the land, time to recover, because you didn't have the sheep grazing there, you didn't have the cattle grazing, but you took them out in the moor with them. And again, I suppose it let the men, get on with the agricultural work, working, particularly turnips, potatoes, these kind of things. So the moor became, that break for them. It also became a very romantic destination, because you would find that, again, I'm looking at my ancestors, that my, I think there was certainly my grandmother's people, my great grandmother's people, they came from Tolstoy on the other side of the moor. And that was true of an awful lot of the ones in the villages of Ness. It kind of, it widened your romantic field. It widened your chance of having again, a partner, because the difficulty, of course, was, particularly if you came from a small community, there was danger of, being married to or becoming involved with a close relative. So by going across the moor, it was allowed you to meet people that you would not normally meet. So you would get that in, you know, there would be an awful lot of that. I think there was a kind of, how shall I put it, there was a mayhem allowed there. To some extent, you know, that you know, in the Presbyterian villages of Lewis would have been clamped down on. So, you know, in a way, you were away from the eyes of your community, and you could indulge yourself in a little mischief if you chose to do so. So I think that is another reason for its appeal. I don't know if that was a pattern in Islay. Did they have shillings in the moor there or not? No. I know I went to the.
Donald, there's a big cave over beyond Bunnahaven,
Yes.
and round the north end of Islay. It's called the Sheeling, and it's a huge cave.
Yeah.
And you've got walls and stuff around it, so it's obvious that people would have taken their beasts and stuff out into the area like that, and there's ruins, buildings and stuff.
When I went to Faroe Islands, you know, a number of years ago, you know, there was I think a professor of Faroese or something who was absolutely desperate to question me, and they had a whole list of Faroese words where there was an equivalent in Scottish Gaelic. You know, for instance, you know, we'd have the word taraf for bull. They'd have the word tarver. And I remember them coming out with the word ari or something similar to it. You know, the Faroese had shillings out in the moor. Shetlanders didn't. You know, Shetlanders, that tradition, you know, wasn't here, whereas it was in Lewis. You know, I think, you know, one of the things we forget, of course, is that the closest island to the Faroe Islands is not Shetland. Again, a bit of whisper that, because it was actually North Fornap, which was part of, you know, my community at one time. So that was something else that was a tradition. I think we were very lucky in Scotland in terms of how we have the moor, and that's one of the themes I write about in the dark stuff. In that, you know, how should I put it? It wasn't seen as a place of punishment. It may have been a slightly chilling place. It may have been a place where we, you know, envisaged murders and ghosts to wander, you know, particularly in winter. But when you go to the continent, it becomes very, very clear that they regarded the moorland in a very different way. And for instance, you know, part of the thing I write about Netherlands, which at one time was just about all peatland at one, you know, stage. There's only a small sections of it now, but they used their peatland as a way of, how should I put it, reforming some of the criminal tendencies of thieves, of prostitutes, of alcohol. You know, go out, get them to cut peats in community. In Germany, many of the initial concentration camps and prison camps were in fact peat cutting camps. Peat cutting camps. You know, Islay, which is right on the German-Dutch border, which I went to see, was one of the first concentration camps where Hitler put all his political opponents. In there tend to be socialist, the occasional Jewish individual, and you know that was their punishment, was cutting peat. You know, Dachau was at one time an artistic peat colony. Now, I understand that this was also the case in Russia, where, you know, that was part of their punishment, was sending people out, you know, to cut peat in terms of punishment. In Scotland, we never had that, because I think we were very lucky in having coal even had coal in the strangest of locations, like Brora, would be the most northerly place. My ancestors were certainly, came from the Dornoch Firth area, and there is a tale that I can tell about that. But they had coal. Countries in the Netherlands, much of Germany, didn't have coal, didn't have. So, in fact, it was more difficult for them to have an industrial revolution than we had. So I think we were very lucky that, in a sense, peat was not the basis of our economy in the same way as it was in the Netherlands, for instance, for centuries. Most of the peatland of the Netherlands has disappeared because it was used for brewing, it was used for distilling, it was used for punishment. And one of the oddest things I find about this book is I get as many inquiries from the Netherlands about it as I do from Scotland. I get an awful lot of inquiries from the Netherlands, and they seem to regard, peat is very important. I also, of course, get inquiries from Ireland too. The dark stuff and the Zens, to my mind, has had a greater impact in the Netherlands, judging by the correspondence I have had than it's had in Scotland.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they lost the peatland. They lost it. It's scientists and ecologists from the Netherlands who were actually behind the attempts to, for Ireland to stop cutting peat. I mean, Ireland, went down, the peat power road in a way that, Scotland avoided. It nearly happened in Scotland. As I said, it nearly happened in places like the Flows, in the Barrettsmuir, and also in Yell and Shetland. But somehow, perhaps because of incompetence, it never occurred. And I think we're very, very lucky.
Wasn't it because we had this model of subsistence farming, of crofting, that protected the much of the peatland area in Scotland?
Yes.
But it now raises an interesting question. I always think that, yes, Scotland didn't destroy the peatlands in the way because people were only taking a little bit every year. It was growing back to some extent. But now we're at 5 minutes to midnight in a climate emergency. What do you think about, should we stop cutting peat at all? But even if it's a very marginal thing, it is, everybody's under pressure to do what they can for the climate emergency. What do you think about that?
But as I say, I think Scotland, as I said, was very fortunate. In many ways, it didn't have to deal with the peat, didn't have to use it as an economic asset because they had the coal. I would hate the thought of telling my, my friends and neighbours, you shouldn't cut peat anymore, especially when I know that so many of them are suffering from, fuel poverty. We know it's an issue, for instance, an issue in Shetland, it's an issue in the Western Isles. And until I think we grapple with that issue, one of the kind of ironies of no longer cutting peat is in a sense, places like the Western Isles have moved from being fuel-rich areas to nowadays, where their dependence on oil become, fuel poverty areas. That's and I think there's a huge issue there, and I would say we have to come up with a solution to that issue before we go in and lecture them about not cutting peat. That's my view, Angus. I have to say, sorry, yes.
As a kind of conservationist sort of thing, and I've walked Isla's peatland across areas where people have cut peats, and I always find that the depressions where where the peats have been cut are always often the wettest areas, and actually are creating more peat than kind of if you say not to cut at all. So I don't small cuttings, I never see it as an issue,
No.
or a wider kind of climate issue or anything, because it creates its own habitat and kind of nurtures a lot of the wetter areas for the plants that need it.
Yeah.
So there's always recovery after the cut.
Yes, and that's great. I'll store that answer myself the next time.
Yeah. I mean, I walked across it. Yeah, I walked across an area surveying today, and it's been heavily cut for peat in the past. But you walk across it, and despite some moderate grazing by cattle, it's deep cushions of sphagnum mosses, which are the things that create peat. So it'll recover in the end. It's the vast fields of peat that gets cut for the gardens and that sort of thing is the issue.
Yeah.
So
I mean, my father was, meticulous in the way, I have worked with other crofters who weren't quite as meticulous as, every single, the turls of peat were put down in the right position. Certainly when I came from, there was a great deal of pride in that. I remember, I remember a woman in the village going out with a cloth to wipe the peat bank clean at the end of every year. There was a real pride in how you looked after the peat bank. That wasn't true in every community, because I have worked in others which will remain nameless, where that wasn't the case. That was not, that they didn't have the same sort of nurture their landscape in the same way. The other book in which I used the peat as a kind of an idea was the one that's been, I think, one of my most successful is A Woman Lay Dreaming, where I have the young boy looking at the very beginning, and he sees the peatland when he comes to Lewis after his mother's death as this desolate, empty space. And yet, when he goes, and he's been strengthened by his time in Lewis, he sees the moorland in all its riches. And, in some ways, I suppose that's me. I mean, I only came to live in Lewis when I was 7. And I remember absolutely fascinated by, we'd go, down the, Farabat, which is not far from the thing, and there would be the Arctic terns, Charnock, and he said they would come down, fly down, and you pester, you almost, give you a haircut when you would cross there. You would see the lapwings coming up, the Curraghack, going up, and it was a different landscape. The curlew, I was telling Angus that, when I was a child, my father used to use, in a sense, the landscape. He would go out and play football, this time of year, and he would say to me, "Higachi, no wines to Glovan, na and Husk. Come home when you hear the curlew or the snipe." And when you were playing football in the twilight, it was as if the curlew and the snipe were blowing the final whistle for your game. You knew you were coming up to about 9 o'clock, and it was time perhaps to go home and get ready for tomorrow. 9:10 even, in midsummer, and so you would go home then. That was your time for going home after playing football for hours on end. Not that I was any good at playing football, but and I think all of that added to a childhood. In some ways, I was brought up to take note of nature. I was taught to observe it, and from a fairly early age, I kind of loved observing. Again, it would be a bit like my Seamus Heaney poetry. I wouldn't have told any of my mates that I was particularly interested in birds and things like that, but it was definitely in there. I just loved watching the birds. I love watching the wildlife.
I think I can hear the curlew calling the final whistle on our meeting.
Yes.
I wonder, did you have any more readings for us, Donald?
No, well, I mean, I've got plenty, but I read one from the man who talks to birds. I wasn't even sure. Again, it's about peat, and they're not all about peat, by the way. An awful lot. Some are about birds, and some are about just kind of philosophy. But there's about 3 or 4, which is about peat. And this is again in June. Behind our house, bog cotton white, in the peat dark ground, star and comet bride, shining when both rain and cloud grind earth-locked spirits down. And then a twist of road, a slow swerve round a corner, flakes of sun are found within a field of buttercups in a sodden stretch of ground, with glimpse of tormentor, a rare monkey flower, the blackbird's yellow beak, pecking at the greyness of our mood with its mellow range of sounds. This is the Corf here in Shetland. It's the only place, I think, in the whole of North Scotland where they have monkey flowers in the drain, in the ditches. You see them. I didn't know what they were. You know, I just knew I'd never seen them before, but they're like giant buttercups. Again, I loved seeing that.
Well, that was very nice, Donald. It's very resonant of Islay at the moment, where the bog cotton is in full flower or flower. I don't know if that the right word, but the bog cotton's everywhere at the moment. So I'll pass over to Fiona to wrap things up, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you very much, Donald, for that. That was it's nice to see sort of how you work with poetry and how you observe and put that into verse. So because I know I do a wee bit of poetry myself, and I was walking across the bog the other day, and I was sort of walking through, finding a nice deer track, and so how difficult it is to walk when you don't find a deer track and all sorts. And it was quite good. I was thinking a few things in my head. That was walking, and
yes, I think it is walking.
Something.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a very good tip for writing. You've got to get out walking.
Out walking. I do think it works for me anyway. You know, that's certainly for that.
It's quite different from Bernard McClaverty when he was it in 2019? I think he was at the Islay Book Festival, and he recommended sitting in a room, putting the blinds down, and put your desk against a wall.
I see that, but he's primarily a prose writer, and I think there is that. And he's a fantastic prose writer. And again, he's somebody whose work I really enjoyed. You know, when I was a young lad coming up. You know, and again, I slightly identify him because I was an English teacher too.
I think if you're going to write about nature and what you see, particularly on peatland or out and about, is you have to get out there and see it and feel it. So,
yes.
Yeah, it's lovely.
It's lovely. So, and it helps you lose weight too, you know, because I do put on weight slightly in the summer. Okay, so Peatland agus go anna ile no Tiel an treachfach agus haineless kunje vis me al nahuris a cham nolas mi stoi a hanni vi ik koppel an hoig Facebook ach seit me an slaan agus falling as kochchi. Okay, Peatland.
Thank you.
I thought I would just finish with Gary.
Thank you, Donald.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks again. Take care. Bye.